Let's start by downloading the Godot game engine. First, go to godotengine.org, and right here you should be greeted by the front page where you can download latest or download LTS. Latest is Godot 4, the most recent version of Godot, and LTS is Godot 3, which is the long support version of Godot. So you're going to start by clicking download latest here, and this should take you to the page where you can actually download a version of it. Now, you have a couple options here. You can download the regular version of Godot, or you can download the Godot.net version. For all of you who are transferring over from Unity, you want the .net because the .net means you have C# support, and you can create things with C#. But in this first part of this tutorial, I'm going to be teaching you the basics of Godot, and we're going to be using GDScript so you can get familiar with the base language, and then we will transition into using C# later. But that being said, we are going to download the .NET version so we have access to C# once we actually start using it. Once it's downloaded, you just want to go to where you actually downloaded the file. And once you are here, you just click in here, and that's it. That's literally all you have to do. We have Godot, the Godot Sharp stuff, and we have these things. What I like to do is I will go to my downloads, and I will actually extract this folder. So I'll go in here, I will extract, and once you've extracted that folder, here you can click this right here, you can click this here, and I usually just keep it in my downloads, and what I do is I grab this exe right here, and I drag it right here to my taskbar, and now I have access to it super easily right here. And that's all there is to it. So then all you have to do is just click this icon down here to open up Godot, and you are now greeted with the project manager. This is the project manager where you'll see all your projects that you're currently working on. For now, we're not going to go into depth of how the project manager works. We're just going to create a project. So right here, you should click New Project, and then you're going to name your project whatever makes sense. In my case, I'm going to call it Learning Godot 4. And I'm going to pick a place that I want to actually put that. So you just put that wherever you want, and then you're going to want to create a unique folder for the project. So all the assets and everything for the actual project itself can be in a folder that is unique. So then next, you want to make sure you pick your renderer. Now, the renderer is going to depend on what you want to do with your game. Compatibility doesn't have a lot of the new features with the Vulkan renderer. Mobile has a little bit more, and Forward Plus has all of the features. And so depending on what type of game you're going to make and what platforms you're going to export to, that's going to determine the renderer mode. And then version control metadata, if you're planning on using version control, make sure you choose Git, because then it creates the project files to work with Git more efficiently. If not, you can do none. I usually just leave Git on. That way, if I decide to eventually move my project to Git, it's not hard to change this. Once you do all that, you just click Create and Edit, and we are now launched into the Godot game engine. As soon as everything loads up, which is fairly quick actually, takes a little bit of time, but then we're in. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is the very top bar. The top bar is all of your views that you have access to. So here's your 2D view for if you're making a 2D game. Here's your 3D view if you're making a 3D game. Here's where you view your scripts, which this looks fairly empty, but when we get to making a script, it will make more sense. And here's the asset library. The asset library is fairly limited in Godot 4. There's a lot more to it in Godot 3, but over time, more people will make plugins, and this is where you can upload plugins for other people to use, which is very nice. And this can be very useful in the future, and it's very similar to Unity's asset store, except all of these are free. So we're hoping that Godot will create some sort of asset store now that this Unity stuff has been happening, so that people can actually sell their plugins and not just give them for free. So that's the hope. So then the next thing we're going to take a look at is this right over here, and this is what is called the scene tree. This is where you have view to all of your nodes. Here's the best way that I can describe what scenes and nodes are in Godot. Scenes are an amalgamation of nodes. They're a bunch of nodes that you put together that you can then save here in the file system of your game, and then you can recall and use those things later. The thing that makes this tricky to understand for a lot of people when you get started is that scenes can be anything. Scenes can be a game level, they could be a UI element, they could be a component, they can be an object, a game object, like a player or an enemy. So As soon as you understand that scenes could be any of those things, and any of those things are represented in Godot using a scene, the easier it'll be to understand the workflow of how Godot works. And in Godot, nodes are the basic building blocks for any objects. They're very similar to the way that you add things to a game object prefab in Unity. And what makes Godot interesting, though, is that these nodes create everything. So you use nodes to create a scene, like a game level. You can use nodes to create a UI element. You can use nodes to create an object. So they're incredibly flexible. Think of them as Legos, and the way that you piece them together can create different monster objects that you can place anywhere. So for example, you can have a basic 2D node, and all a 2D node does is it holds position, rotation, anything related to like Z index. It has a lot of properties for things 2D related. And what Godot does is it inherits from base classes to create new classes. So eventually we inherit down from 2D node, we can inherit down a couple steps and we get physics bodies, and that's where we get our physics bodies for the player and stuff. So there's a lot of built-in nodes that you can use. There's area nodes with collision shapes, which you can use for trigger boxes. And there's all sorts of nodes basically built into Godot from the start, and you can create your own nodes and stuff using scenes. So you put together nodes to create a scene, and you can use that scene in another scene, if that makes it's very inceptive. So we're just gonna jump in. I'm gonna just show you, and that's going to be the easiest way for you guys to understand how this works. So the first thing we need to do is create the root node. So for this scene, this is the scene tree. We're creating whatever the root node, the center node is for the scene. So in this case, we're going to start by creating a game level that the whole game can inhabit in. So that we're going to do a 2D scene, and this creates our 2D node. And what you'll immediately notice when I create that is over here on the right, this is the inspector. The inspector has all of the properties of whatever node you currently have selected. So here's our node 2D. You'll notice if I click off of it and on, you can see that it populates. So look at all these things that the node 2D has. It has position, rotation, scale, a skew value, and all of this stuff. There's a lot of things, so don't get overwhelmed by this right now. Just think about the fact that this is the root node of the scene, the main root, and these are all the properties of it. So we're going to actually call this game level, and we're going to now save this into our file system. So here's the file system. This is how you access files in Godot. It's very similar to the file system in Unity or any other game engine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to create a new folder. And what I'm going to call this folder is I'm going to call this Game Scenes. And then I'm going to create another folder called Game Objects. This is how I prefer to sort my stuff in Godot. So game scenes represents the in-game actual scenes like levels and menus, and game objects represents actual objects. This helps my brain to separate the difference between the two, even though they are all represented in the same way, if that makes sense. Game objects and game scenes are represented with Godot scenes. So now what we can do is we can actually hit Control S to save the current scene that we have. And we're literally just going to go into game scenes, and I'm just going to go and create another folder called game level, and we're going to put the game level scene in that folder. And there we go. Now we have saved the current game level Godot scene into the game scenes folder. So now that we have that, we're actually going to go and create a new scene, and we're going to create a little player that will be able to move around. So now you're going to go up here to the scenes in the top left, and you're going to click New Scene. And this is going to give us that same thing we saw before. And you'll notice it splits it into a new tab here. So now I can toggle between these two scenes since they're open. So now, this new scene, we're going to create a game object, and we're going to create the player that can move around. So we're going to go Other Node, and we are actually looking for a character body. So if you type in character here in the search bar, you should get character body. And this is a node that allows for movement and stuff without you having to code it all from scratch. So what we're going to do is we're going to click this, we're going to double click it. And now our root node is a character body. The first thing you're going to notice probably when you create this is this little warning symbol. So if you click this warning, you'll notice it says, this node has no shape, so it can't collide or interact with other objects. Consider adding a collision shape 2D or collision polygon 2D as a child to define its shape. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a collision shape as a child. And that is basically how the scene tree works, is you have nodes, and you can have nodes be children of those nodes. And so it's a child-parent relationship. So if you have a root scene, and as a child you have a collision shape, the character body in this case would be the parent to the collision shape, and the collision shape would be a child to the character body. Understanding that that's how the scene tree is laid out is going to be beneficial for understanding how all these scenes eventually going to interact with each other. So we're going to actually right click on this, and you'll notice right here, add child node. It's the very first thing. So if we click that, we are going to now type in collision. And you'll notice we have two options, a collision polygon and a collision shape. A collision polygon allows you to customize the shape by setting each of the points of the collision, and the collision shape has a couple of preset collision shapes that you can set to it. So we're going to use a collision shape 2D because it's simpler and easier, and we probably just want the player to be a circle for this game. So if we click this, we can double click it, and there it is in the scene. But now we have another warning. So if we click this, this says, a shape must be provided for the collision shape 2D to function. Please create a shape resource for it. So now, well, what do we do? Because we only know how to add objects to our scene. But now, if you remember, if we click on a node, over here in the inspector, it shows the node's properties. So if we click this collision shape 2D, right here at the very top is our shape property. So we can click where it says empty, and we can create, there's a couple of different types of things, but like I said, we're going to create a circle shape 2D. And immediately here in the scene, if I move around, you can actually move around the scene using the middle mouse wheel to grab and move around, and the wheel to zoom in and zoom out. And that's how I navigate around the space. So now you'll notice we have this collision shape, and we can actually change the size of it with this little grabber point right here. If we click this and drag, it changes the size of it. So we're going to just leave it for now. We can Control Z to undo those scaling things. So now that we have created this collision shape, we now need some way to visually see the player on screen, to represent the player. So at this point, we actually need an asset. So we actually need to drag in some sort of asset that we can use to display our player, because currently our project folder over here does not have any assets. We don't have any sprites, any textures that we can use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a new folder here in this file system, and I'm going to call it assets. And with this, I'm going to create a another folder in here, and I'm going to call it sprites. So now that I've actually created this sprites folder, I'm actually going to open up in my just file explorer. I am going to open up where I have my assets. And for this game, I'm going to be using a Kenny asset pack so that it's easily accessible for you guys to use as well. So we're going to go here and we're going to just take this sprites folder, all of these different sprites. I'm going to grab these. They're all sorted by different type. We're going to grab all of these, and I'm going to drag them into the sprites folder here. And something that is not super intuitive in Godot is when you drag something into the file system, the actual file you have selected is where it will go. So an issue here you'll notice is if I create another folder here and I call it random folder, if I have this random folder selected and I take these files and I try dragging them right here to the sprite, they're actually not going to go to the sprite. They're going to go to the random folder because that's what I had selected. So a little tidbit, just so you know, if you ever try to drag something in and it becomes confusing, make sure you have the thing selected that you want it to drag to, and then drag your files in. And in that way, what's kind of nice is you don't actually have to go and try to put it here. If you want to drag in new files, all you need to do is select the folder you want it to drag those files into, and then you just drag them into Godot. You can place them anywhere in the project, and it will automatically load them in, which is a nice little tidbit to know. So I'm going to remove this random folder now, and now we have access to all of these sprites in Godot. We can go into sprites, and you'll notice we have access to all of these. We can double-click them, and right over here in the inspector, we can actually visually see these sprites as we click on them, which is really nice. So now that we have our sprites, we want the player to be represented with a sprite 2D. I'm going to show you two ways that you can do this. One way is you go to your character body and you create a new child node. We're looking for a sprite, so let's type sprite, and here's our sprite 2D. So we click this, And now that we have this sprite, we can actually go to our file folder over here and look for the sprite that we want. And what we want is some sort of rocket for the player to have. So we're going to go here and we're going to take this basic space rocket. And if we click this sprite 2D and we drag this sprite over to texture, so you can drag this into texture, and there it is. It's in the project, and you have your sprite, which is very nice. The other way that you can go about this is you can actually just take the PNG and you can drag it directly into the scene, and it will automatically create a sprite 2D and load the texture. So that's a much quicker way of doing it once you understand that that's what it's doing. So now that we have this, I'm going to change this and just rename it to sprite. I'm going to go here to my collision shape 2D, and I'm just going to rename this collision, just to keep the name short. And I'm going to rename our character body to just player. And I'm going to rename my character body to just player, to keep it simple. Now that we have this is the basics of this setup. We have a collision, and we have a sprite. Now that we've created the ship, we actually want to probably change this collision shape to match better the rocket. So we can actually go in here, and you'll notice we can't actually see the collision shape. And this is where I get into the way that Godot renders things. Godot renders things from top to bottom on the tree. So your scene tree, it's going to render them layer-wise here, here, and here. So in order to make the collision shape visible, all we have to do is bring it down in the tree. And for a lot of people, a hard part of Godot is figuring out how to structure their trees. But knowing the fact that trees in their order results in a rendering order and how things are displayed will help to imply to you what order you want the nodes to be in the tree. So now that we can see our collision shape again, we notice it's a very small circle. And even if I bump up the circle, it doesn't really work for what we want now. So we're going to go over here to our shape, and if we want to change it, all we have to do is right-click it, and we can click a new one. We're going to do a capsule shape. We want to go to the right width of the rocket, and then we want to drag this to go for the length of it. And the interesting thing you'll notice here is that this one collision shape doesn't really take up the whole sprite. We have these two little boosters on the side. And so if we want to be able to add collision to those, we could jut this out. But now there's all this space that doesn't make sense for collision. So something that's kind of nice about the way these nodes work that require collision is they can have multiple collision shapes. So we can actually go and duplicate these collision shapes, and we can have one right here for this booster, and one right here for this booster. So now, let's go and change the size of these. But what you'll notice is if I change the size of these, it changes all of them, which is kind of weird. Why does it do that? Well, all of these are copied and pasted from each other, and they are using a shape 2D, and this shape 2D is what is called a resource in Godot. So, like we talked about before, nodes give you functionality. They can draw sprites, they can do all sorts of things like that. They are things that allow you to do stuff. Resources, on the other hand, contain data. Their job is to have variables and data types that allow you to access them and use them. They contain some sort of data of some kind. Now, resources can also have functions and do things, and you can make your own resources, but that's the simple idea, is that resources can be saved and used, and you can have resource types that represent different types of data. In this case, this capsule shape is actually a type of resource that contains data for storing the collision for a capsule shape. If you would like a more in-depth explanation as to how resources work in Godot, please check out this video by Peffiper. The link will be in the description. The issue is when we copied and pasted these, it duplicates the resource. So all of them have the same resource. So if we want to make these two unique, what we can actually do is I can go in one of these collision shapes and right-click this, and there's this button called Make Unique. And that will make it a unique collision shape. Then I can actually right-click this, and I can copy this collision shape data, and I can go over here to this other collision and paste it here. Now these two are copying each other, so if I move one, they both move together. So that is how you can have certain collision shapes, and you can modify them and have multiple matching. So it's really nice. What's cool about these resources too is you can actually save them. You can save them over here in the file tree structure. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call it resources. And in this resource folder, we're going to right click it, and we're going to create a new folder called collision shapes. And what I can do is in this first collision shape, we can right click this and we can save it. So this is going to go into our resources, collision shapes, and this is going to be main rocket collision. And then this one over here, we're going to save. And this is going to be our side rocket collision. And what you'll notice is renaming those changes the name here in the inspector. What's cool is now I can actually tab to these, and I'll notice they have the exact same side rocket resource, so it's really easy to tell if they're using the same thing or not. So that's how resources work, and we'll delve more and more into resources as we progress. We now have the basics for our player, and we have now, hopefully you understand a little bit of how Godot is structured, the framework of the engine itself, and how that works. So now the next step we need to do is actually take this player scene and save it. So we do, if you remember, we hit Control S. We go to where we want to save it. In this case, this is a game object. So we're going to go to game objects. We're going to create a folder called player, and we're going to save it right in here. Now, we want to get this player inside of our game level. So this is what I was talking about at the beginning with Godot scenes, how you create Godot scenes and you can reuse them. So if you click on this game level, we can right click it and you can instantiate a child scene. And what instantiate child scene does, instead of instantiating a node, it instantiates one of the scenes we have created. So you'll see here's our player and here's our game level. So we just click player and now our player is in the game level. So now, let's move our player to the center of the screen. We'll hit Control S to save it. And then we need to run the scene. So this is where we go into what these little icons in the top right of the engine do. So what this will do is this will run the project in whatever your boot scene is, which we haven't talked about what a boot scene is. So if we click this, you'll notice it says, no main scene has ever been defined, select one. You can change it later in the project settings. So we're going to click cancel for now, but you could select the current one. You could select one via a project folder, or you can cancel. So we're going to cancel this for now. Right here, you can pause your current scene. So if you're running a scene, you can pause the gameplay to be able to make adjustments here in the editor and then save them so it doesn't cause issues, runtime issues, and then you can unpause. I don't use this very frequent, but it's nice for debugging if you need to change a variable and then you need to test it immediately in the situation that you're in. The stop button will stop running the project. Pretty self-explanatory. And then this is the button we want. This allows you to run the current scene you have open, which is our game level. So we will actually do that. If we click this button, we run the scene, and there's our rocket in the scene. This button here is running a specific scene. So you can actually click this, and it will bring up all your scenes in your project, and you can run a specific individual scene. So this is a nice way if you want to run a specific scene, and you're not currently in the scene and you don't want to have to tab over to it. There's also hotkeys, so you can do this and you can do Control Shift F5 and this will open it up, and that's a really quick way of opening it too. And then the last thing here is enable movie maker mode. And this is a new thing in Godot 4 that's super, super great for playing and recording gameplay. But for now, we're not going to worry about messing with this. If you would like to mess with the movie maker mode, then feel free to look at the Godot documentation, and it will give you a little bit of a tutorial on how to do that. Lastly here, this is what I was talking about our renderer. So if you want to, at any time in your project, change the renderer to export to different render types, you can go in here and you can change it. And when you change it, it's going to ask you to save and restart the editor to do that. So I'm not going to do that. But that's how you would go about changing the renderer setting. And that is the basics of how you build and structure things in Godot. Every advanced concept from this builds from these basic concepts. So the moment you understand how all of this works, the moment you can immediately progress onward in creating more complex objects. So if you need to rewatch this video a couple times to understand the basics of Godot itself, then feel free to. But if not, then you can progress on to the next video.